Hello and welcome to VVork. I'm Brian Watrous. This is part 11 in a 10-part series of videos on how to automate with vRealize Orchestrator. That's right, part 11. This is a bonus episode. Let's jump in and see what's going on here. As you can see from the title of this on this particular slide, the purpose of this video is to explore a bit deeper into the issue of parameter binding, sometimes called variable binding, whatever you want to call it, just call it binding. You need to know how to do binding. So let's dig a little deeper than we have in the earlier parts of this video series and learn some more. Speaking of the earlier parts of this video series, if you have not already seen video number 7 of this 10-part video series, go back and take a look at that. Make certain you understand that video first before viewing this one. Since you've seen that previous video, you'll recall that we talked about how in the world of Orchestrator, you can create inward bindings and outward bindings. Inward bindings enable you to read the value that's in a variable. In other words, you'll be able to do things like this JavaScript code, which is going to log a message. What's the message going to be? Well, it's whatever's in the myvar variable. For this system.log method to work, we have to have read access or an inward binding to the variable called myvar. And similarly, outward binding allows us to change the value that's in a variable. So in other words, if we want to do something such as this JavaScript code where we're assigning a new value to the variable called myvar, in this case, since we're doing an assignment, we would need an outward binding. So that's review. This slide here is also a review. Again, I encourage you to pause the video, take a look at this, pause the video, and figure out what kind of binding would you need. Well, as you already know from the previous video, that was a trick question. You need 2 different kinds of bindings. In order to do the right side of this expression, the myvar variable that we're looking at here is a variable whose contents we need to see. We need to see what's in that variable, so we need an inward binding. On the other hand, the use of myvar on the left side of the variable is an assignment. We need to be able to change the value that's in that variable. That requires an outward binding. Again, all this so far is review. One of the things that you're going to want to be able to do at times is look at your own workflow or somebody else's workflow and quickly figure out which schema elements have been bound to which input parameters, output parameters, and attributes. Now, one way of doing that would be to go to the Schema tab and click on each and every single schema element one at a time to figure out which schema elements are looking at which input parameters, output parameters, and attributes. But you don't have to do it that slow brute force way. Instead, as you can see on the screen here, a little bit to the right of the Schema tab, there's a tab labeled Parameter References. And by default, what it will display for you is information about all the input parameters and all the output parameters in your workflow. If you'd also like to see the attributes in your workflow and where they're being used, make certain to check this checkbox. So looking at this simple display here, I can see that in the workflow that we're editing, we have, let's work our way backwards. We have one output parameter called out1. I know it's an output parameter because of this green leftward pointing arrow. I have 3 input parameters called in1, in2, and in3. Notice that input parameters have an arrow that's yellow pointing to the right. And then these 4 variables up above called attribute 1 through attribute 4 are attributes, which is what the A icon indicates. So for each of our input parameters, output parameters, and attributes, there will be a separate line in the parameter references screen. It will mention for each variable the name of the variable, its type, and additionally it tells you whether it's an attribute, input parameter, or output parameter. In addition, there are some triangles that you can click on to find out more information about each of these variables. And we'll do that in a moment, but notice, if you would, that attribute number 3 and input parameter 3 both don't have that triangle. They both have the number 3 in their name, but the point of this isn't the names, but rather variables that show up here on this screen that don't have the triangle to the left of them are variables that have not been bound to any schema element. If I'm all done writing my workflow, one of the things I'll do is go look at the parameter reference tab to see if I have any unbound input parameters, output parameters, or attributes. If I do, it won't hurt the program. It will cause the validator to generate a warning, but the program will still run. But as a matter of good, clean programming practice, I always make certain when I'm done writing my workflows that I go to the parameter references tab and make certain I get rid of any variables that I'm not using, simply because that will make my workflow clearer and it's just less sloppy. Over here on the right side of this slide, I've drawn an illustration of a workflow. And as you can see, this workflow has different input parameters, an output parameter, and several different attributes. Now, the diagram here is one that I've created to illustrate bindings in my workflow, but you won't see a diagram like this in the Orchestrator client. Instead, if you want to see this same type of information in the Orchestrator client, you can use the Parameter References tab. So let's look at the Parameter References tab over here on the left side. As you can see, it's got a lot of information, and admittedly, it can be a little bit overwhelming at first, but let's break this down. Let's focus on the input parameter called in1. So you'll notice in my diagram that in1 is an input parameter that has a binding, an inward binding, to some variable in the schema element called E1, and another inward binding to a schema element, another inward binding to a variable in schema element 3. But again, you won't see that diagram in Orchestrator. What you will see in Orchestrator, if you go to the Parameter References tab, is that the Parameter References tab tells you here that there is an input parameter. It's a string. The thing in parentheses here indicates the data type of the variable. And over here on the right, we have the name of the string. That's the same information that we saw in the previous slide. But in addition to that, if you hit the triangle button for this input parameter, it will expand on the Parameter References tab, and you'll see more information. You'll see in this example, since there's two bindings, you'll see two lines. In this example, you'll see over on the right side of each line, in parentheses, the name of the schema element or schema elements that have a binding to the variable called in1. In addition, over here, you have an icon that will have a triangle on the left side of the icon or on the right side of the icon. If the triangle is on the left side of the icon, that means that we have an inward binding. If the triangle is on the right side of the icon, that means we have an outward binding. The icon itself can be a rectangle, as you see in this example here. You'll see a rectangle icon if the schema element is a scriptable task. On the other hand, if the schema element that we have the binding to is a workflow, you would see a rectangle with one side rounded. If the schema element we were binding to was a decision schema element of some sort, the icon shape then is a diamond. So different icon shapes here indicate what type of schema element the variable binding has been hooked up to. But again, we see the name of the schema element that has the variable bound to it. Just to the left of that, you have the name of in this case, the input parameter in case you forgot it from the line above. And over here, you have an icon plus some triangles to indicate, crucially, whether you have an inward binding or an outward binding. So if we continue onwards here, just digging a little deeper, notice that attribute number 4 in our diagram has an inward binding to schema element 3, and we can see the same thing reported over in the Parameter References tab. It says that there's an inward binding for the variable called attr4, and that's a binding to some variable inside of E3, our schema element called E3. But that's not the only binding we have for attribute 4. We also have this binding. Over here in the diagram, you can see that we have an outward binding to attribute attr4 from some variable in schema element 3. And that's the same thing we see over here in the Parameter References tab. E3 has a binding to the variable called attr4, and it's an outward binding. So, admittedly, in the beginning, when I first started using the Parameter References tab 10 years ago, I had a bit of difficulty initially figuring out what this was trying to tell me and how to use it. One of the things I really wish someone would have told me, and I'm going to tell you right now, something that would have helped me to understand parameter references much sooner than I did, is the fact that these variables that you see listed here are in alphabetical order. Again, if someone had told me that, my life would have been much easier. Hopefully your life will be easier when working with these, with the information on the Parameter References tab, with that little piece of info. But let's continue onwards here. Once again, I have a diagram here illustrating a workflow. And as you can see, this workflow has some input parameters, it has an output parameter, and it has some attributes. And as you can see inside of this workflow, we've got some schema elements that are doing something. I don't know exactly what. I don't really care. This is just a generic example. Maybe this is a workflow that's creating a virtual machine. Maybe it's a workflow that builds a machine in Amazon AWS. Maybe it's a virtual machine, maybe it's a workflow that's going to register an IP address in your IP address management system. This workflow could be doing all sorts of useful things. But for the person who's calling your workflow, they don't have to know or understand or have ever seen all this complexity that we see illustrated here in this diagram. Because to somebody who's calling your workflow, what they're going to see is basically a black box. They'll know from the name of the workflow and its description. You're typing good descriptions, right? So when you create your workflow, you give it a good name and a good description so that whoever's calling your workflow will know what the workflow does. And then all they need to know, or all they need to do, is to find out what your input parameters are, what your output parameters are, and hook them up. Again, they just know about the ins and the outs. They hook them up to their workflow, and then suddenly their workflow can call your workflow. They don't have to see all of the complexity inside of the black box. Now, I call it a black box. That's a metaphor. In actual practice, in the workflow that somebody else is embedding your workflow into, your workflow is just going to show up as one of these icons. So your workflow will be embedded into their workflow. And again, their job is not to understand the complexity of your workflow, but rather their job is to find out what the inputs are to your workflow, what the outputs are of your workflow, and then hook up their workflow through variable binding, parameter binding, to your workflow. So that means they're going to need to hook up, whoever is calling your workflow, he's going to need to hook up his input parameter to your schema element. If your schema element has, if your workflow they're calling has multiple inputs, then he'd have to do multiple inward bindings. He'll also have to do outward bindings, which we'll talk about in a moment. But within his workflow, he's free to feed in information or capture information through attributes instead. So maybe he wants to feed in your first input parameter from an input parameter of his own, but for your second input parameter, maybe he's going to feed that in from an attribute of his own. He's free to do that. But as I said before, when he calls your workflow, he's also going to need to have an output parameter to connect your output parameter to. Or alternatively, your workflow's output could be outwardly bound to one of his attributes. But again, his job is not to know the complexity inside your workflow, but rather to simply hook up your workflow's inputs and outputs to variables in his own workflow. Now, one more thing to know about parameter binding is the following common design practice. In workflows, you'll commonly see a workflow that has something like this input parameter, in1. And what you might be tempted to do is to change the value of input parameter in1 within your workflow. So for instance, in schema element 1, if we bind the input parameter in1 to the local variable called myvar in E1, if we set up an inward binding, you might be tempted in E1 to say something like this: myvar equals 1, 2, 3. But that code cannot possibly work in the way that we want it to, because without an outward binding, any assignment that we attempt to do to myvar is not going to succeed. The value of in1 will not change in this case, no matter how we try to change the variable called myvar, because in1 has an inward binding. And similarly, so that's not going to work. Similarly, when you have output parameters in your workflow, at times you might be tempted to view what's the value of this output parameter called myOutputParameter. Well, in reality, you're not going to ever be able to see the value of any of your output parameters from within your workflow, because much as input parameters are read-only, you can only see what's in them, you can't change them, output parameters are write-only. You can change their value, but you can't see what's in them. So if you attempt in your workflow to say something like system.log, and then you specify, I want to see the contents of an output parameter, that's not going to work. So these two types of things don't work. So what do you do? Well, the common design pattern that I want to talk about here involves allowing you to feed in whatever input parameters you want, and similarly send out any output parameters that you want, but to be able to have the flexibility to change the value of input parameters or see the value of output parameters. Now, strictly speaking, that's not quite how it works. Let's see how it actually does work. So you just set up your input parameters and your output parameters as you normally would, but if there's an input parameter such as in1 and you need to change its value within your workflow, for instance in E1, if you want to change the value of in1, you can't. But what you can do is copy the input parameter in1 to an attribute. So we'll take in1 and copy it to attribute 1. Now those two variables both have the number 1 in their name. That's not a requirement. The names don't have to be at all alike. But if you bind an input parameter to an attribute, you're going to be able to work with the value of the input parameter and change it. Again, keep watching, I'll show you what I mean. And you can do that with multiple variables. So maybe we're going to bind input parameter in1 to attribute attr1 and in2 to attribute attr2. But crucially, once you do the trickery I'm about to show you, you're going to be able to do things like change the value of the attributes. You're still not going to be able to change the value of the input parameters because input parameters are read-only. But because you will have copied the input parameter values into the attributes, and because attributes are read-write, you'll not only be able to see what value is in the attributes, you'll be able to change the value of the attributes. So within schema elements that come after this special first E1 schema element, you'll be able to do all sorts of things you want with the attributes. A similar trick can be employed for output parameters. Again, output parameters in your workflow, the output parameters, you can change their values all you want, but you can never see the value of output parameters. So as a common design pattern, at the end of your workflow, you'll copy attributes that you've been working with in your workflow, copy their values to output parameters so that the user or whoever or whatever is calling your workflow will see those values. So same sort of deal again. If you have some value in attribute 3 that you've been messing around with in this workflow and you need to make certain that whoever or whatever is calling your workflow can see that value, you can't pass out the attribute, but what you could do is bind, wrong direction there, you could set up a binding to an output parameter, and then within schema element E3 at the end of your workflow, you could just simply copy the attribute value to an output parameter. And again, maybe you do that with one attribute, maybe you do it with multiple attributes. But the key part of this design pattern here is either at the beginning or the end of your workflow, you add a schema element that's either going to copy in input parameters and copy them to attributes, or at the end of your workflow, having a schema element that will take attributes and copy them to output parameters. That's a very common design pattern. So here comes the secret sauce that makes it work. You already know how to set up bindings, so there's nothing really new that I've shown you here so far. What's a mystery is how do we copy the input parameters to attributes, or how do we copy the attributes to output parameters? Well, it turns out it's really easy. You're just going to swap out, you're not going to have E1, E3, you're going to have schema elements at the beginning and or end of the workflow, and they need to be scriptable tasks. And in those scriptable tasks, you're going to add some simple code. So for instance, if you want to copy your input parameters to attributes, you just say attribute variable name equals input variable name. For instance, attr1 equals attr, try that again, attr1 equals in1 semicolon would copy input parameter 1 into attribute 1. And you can do that with input parameter 2 and 3 and 4. This will work for any number of input parameters. And similarly, at the end of your workflow, if you need to copy attributes out to output parameters, assuming you've got your binding set up, you'll have very similar code. You'll just say the output parameter equals whichever attribute you're trying to capture the value of. So again, that's a fairly straightforward design pattern. Hopefully I haven't overcomplicated it too much here. If you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comment section down below. But do leverage this design pattern in your workflows. Don't try to change the value of input parameters. Don't try to see what's in output parameters. Those things don't work. What does work is this design pattern. So again, that's a bit more about parameter binding, variable binding, a design pattern, and so forth. Again, if you have any questions, feel free to pose them in the comments down below. But for now, that's it for this video. Have fun using this new parameter binding knowledge, and I'll see you in some future videos.